The military operations unfolding in the Middle East are completely contrary to the strategy the department has put forth. Why has the department abandoned the strategy after 39 days?
I'd completely reject that characterization.
The president has moved the goalposts constantly and now has conveniently thrown out all the rationales as justification for this war of choice. If regime change was nothing with respect to the military objectives, why was the first objective in the campaign attack and death of Khamenei?
I wouldn't characterize the president. He sets our agenda, and he directed these military goals. I'm talking about, sir, about the goals of the American military campaign.
How do you separate the military goals from the president of the United States? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary. As I stated in my opening statement, the NDS specifically states that in the Middle East, the department, quote, will empower regional allies and partners to take primary responsibility for deterring and defending against Iran and its proxies, close quote. Furthermore, the NDS repeatedly states that while our allies will receive critical support from the U.S., it'll be much more limited. This national security strategy was published, by my count, about 39 days ago. So, Secretary Colby, the military operations unfolding in the Middle East are completely contrary to the strategy the department has put forth. Why has the department abandoned the strategy after 39 days?
Well, Senator, I'd completely reject that characterization, sir. If you look in the strategy, it details specifically not only the threat posed by Iran and ensuring that the president has the options to act against Iran first. Secondly, it also explicitly and repeatedly details that the strategy will provide the ability for the president to use particularly effectively air and maritime forces, standoff kind of or overhead kind of forces to do exactly this kind of operation, obviously things like Midnight Hammer. And then thirdly, I would say that we actually are, Senator, seeing a real example. Obviously, our Israeli allies are really leaning in, but we see that from our Gulf partners right now. We see it from other partners in Europe. So I don't think this is an invalidation at all, Senator.
Well, so our Gulf powers, our partners are taking primary responsibility as it's described in NDS?
Well, Senator, primary responsibility specifically refers in particular to the European context, the South Korean context. We're looking at Israel in particular. It's a general theme. It's a little bit more differentiated how we're talking about. We obviously want allies and partners throughout to be able to take responsibility, but we're looking as a general. It's not a kind of straitjacket, if you will.
Did we notify our allies and partners, except Israel, of course?
I defer to the operational or other the Department of State on that.
Mr. Secretary, I would assume that you would be vitally involved in that notification process. Did we notify our partners?
I have myself been on the phone with a number of ministers in subministerial level since the outbreak of the operation on Saturday. So I know we've notified them. The exact timing, I defer to others more senior in the
Thank you. The military and strategic objectives of the Iran operation have varied from eliminating the nuclear program, taking out the ballistic missile arsenal, protecting Iranian civilians, cutting off support to Iranian proxies, and defending the American people in general and our allies. The president has moved the goalposts constantly and now has conveniently thrown out all the rationales as justification for this war of choice. Secretary Colby, can you, as the lead policy advisor of the Pentagon, explain the objectives of this operation, and can they be accomplished by airstrikes and air power alone?
Well, Senator, I think I can lay out once again the objectives of the military campaign, which have been directed by the president, were elucidated by Secretary Hegseth and General Kane yesterday in their briefing, which are focused on addressing the ability of the Islamic Republic to project military power against, of course, us, our bases, our forces, et cetera, as well as our allies and partners in the region and beyond. And that's primarily the missile forces of the Islamic Republic, which had obviously been growing substantially and posed a very serious threat to all of those equities that I just mentioned, as well as the ability to produce that, and then the Iranian Navy. Those are the primary focus of the military campaign. I do think those are scoped and reasonable objectives that can be attained. I think at the same time, the president, for instance, has made comments, and I wouldn't speak for him, but my interpretation of how the military campaign nests under that is he has urged the Iranian people to take this unprecedented opportunity to, supplant or overthrow this oppressive Islamic Republic. But the military campaign, as detailed, that he has directed, is focused on the power projection capabilities. And at the end of this campaign, yes, primarily relying on aerospace and maritime forces, that will have substantially set back a threat that, sir, you just yourself detailed as such a opprobrious and noxious threat.
Now, if regime change was nothing with respect to the military objectives and the president was just sort of wandering off, why was the first objective in the campaign the attack and death of Khamenei and key leaders of the regime?
We'll just try to answer quickly. I wouldn't characterize the president. He sets our agenda, and he directed these military goals. I'm talking about, sir, about the goals of the American military campaign.
How do you separate the military goals from the president of the United States?
I'm not, sir. I was talking about those are Israeli operations.
The chairman is enforcing his rule as he must. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary Colby. Thank you for appearing today to testify about the administration's 2026 National Defense Strategy, or the NDS. I'll turn shortly to the specifics of that document, but I must be direct at the outset. The NDS is a flawed proposal, and it is now, in many respects, already obsolete. As we sit here today, the President has engaged the United States in major combat operations against Iran. Over the past several days, American forces operating alongside Israel have conducted thousands of strikes against Iran's missile sites, command and control sites, and senior regime leadership. Ayatollah Khamenei and many other senior leaders have been killed. Iran has retaliated with missile and drone attacks across the region, resulting in American casualties. And to the families of those service members killed and wounded, we owe our deepest condolences and our solemn commitment that their sacrifices will be honored. Let me be clear. The Iranian regime has been a brutal, corrupt, deadly institution for decades. And the day it is replaced by a government that actually serves the Iranian people will be a victory for all. However, in taking these offensive military actions, President Trump has unilaterally started a conflict that is rapidly spreading throughout the Middle East. The end state is unknown. Even administration officials cannot say clearly what objectives they are trying to achieve, nor what happens when those objectives are met. In the meantime, there will be immense costs for the Department of Defense in readiness, in opportunity, and most importantly, in American lives. The President and the Secretary of Defense have promised that this conflict will be brief and decisive, and I'm skeptical. With perhaps the exception of Desert Storm, no war in the Middle East has ever been brief or decisive. If past is prologue, I fear President Trump will simply claim he's won, withdraw, and leave behind a crippled state, a regional proxy war, and a humanitarian catastrophe that could reverberate for years. And if this regime ultimately survives, the Iranian people will pay a heavy price. Secretary Colby, on the topic of ongoing operations, I hope you will provide the committee with clarity. What are the administration's objectives in Iran? What is the theory of victory? And what authority does the administration believe it is waging this war under, given that Congress has not been consulted or authorized any conflict? Indeed, one would argue very seriously that this is not consistent with the Constitution. Now, let me turn to the National Defense Strategy. I'd like to note at the outset something that is easy to overlook but impossible to ignore: the tone of this document. Previous national defense strategies, authored by both Republican and Democratic administrations, have been sober, analytical assessments of the threat environment. This one is instead littered with partisan commentary. It attacks the rule-based international order, the very norms and institutions that we built after the most devastating conflict in human history, and that have helped prevent a third world war while enabling America's rise as the world's foremost military and economic power. And I would welcome a debate about how we can improve our alliances, but we should not disparage the foundations of our own success. As Secretary Colby, I would ask you to explain the highly partisan and backward-looking language of the National Defense Strategy. The NDS starts by stating that the department's priority mission is to defend the homeland. Of course, that has always been the primary effort of the military and our nuclear deterrent and cyber forces, among other capabilities. In addition, the Defense Department has long been a key partner to the Department of Homeland Security for providing intelligence and logistical support for drug interdiction. However, this NDS intends to reach much further, blending national security and law enforcement by fundamentally involving the military in border security and counter-narcotic trafficking operations. On China, the NDS states that our presence in the Indo-Pacific should not be used to, quote, dominate, humiliate, or strangle Beijing, and that, quote, a decent peace on terms favorable to America, but that China can also accept and live under is possible, close quote. Secretary Colby, I'd like to know specifically what military options the department is prepared to forego within that framing, and what precisely constitutes a decent peace. When China has spent the last decade systematically manipulating the security environment in its favor. I would also note that this strategy appears focused almost exclusively on the first island chain, while China is actively expanding its security partnerships across the Indo-Pacific, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And I hope you will address whether the department intends to cede that competition to Beijing by default. On Russia, your strategy is quite clear. Russia is Europe's problem. It would seem Americans' concern should be limited to Moscow's nuclear arsenal and its capabilities in space and cyber. While I understand the logic of pursuing the right balance of U.S. military capabilities with those of our European allies, I do not accept the abdication of our clear national security interest in Europe by suggesting Russia is their problem to manage. Further, the contrast between how this document treats China and how it treats its allies is frankly dumbfounding. The NDS takes a conciliatory posture towards Beijing, yet derides the nations that have stood alongside us for 80 years, describing our allies as more dependencies than partners. I am encouraged by the progress our allies have made in increasing their defense spending, but alliances are not merely burden-sharing arrangements. They are the foundation of our international strength, and they also bear the cost to the United States military conflicts we're seeing right now in the Middle East. Demeaning our partners is a self-inflicted wound. Secretary Colby, it is worth recalling that the 2018 NDS from the first Trump administration, which described our alliance network as, quote, the backbone of global security. You are one of the lead authors of that NDS, and I'd like to understand what has so thoroughly changed your perspective on the role of our allies. Finally, I would point out the most fundamental problem with this NDS. It bears no resemblance to what this administration is actually doing. The strategy states the department will, quote, empower regional allies and partners to take primary responsibility for deterring and defending against Iran and its proxies. And yet the United States has just launched the largest military campaign since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It is unclear if our allies were even aware of the planning of this operation. Further, the administration has carried out thousands of strikes in Yemen, Syria, Somalia, Nigeria, and other nations over the past year. And of course, we carried out a massive military attack in Venezuela to capture Nicolas Maduro. And we continue to conduct strikes on alleged drug boats with no clear articulation of what goals we are pursuing. Mr. Secretary, your NDAS states, quote, no longer will the department be distracted by interventionism, endless wars, regimes change, and nation building. Yet we have repeatedly intervened, started wars, and sought regime change in the past 8 weeks alone, much less the past year. Secretary Colby, I look forward to your testimony and explanation of this NDS and how it reflects what the Department of Defense is actually doing.